They said her eyes never blinked, not when the blade rose, nor when the cold breath of dawn whispered across her throat. There she stood, bare neck, bare soul, bare truth wrapped in the silk of a silence no prayers could penetrate. And in that silence, the crows did not caw, the sun did not warm, and the king had already turned his face away. She was not born a queen, but she died like one unnamed, unwept, untouched by mercy. They called her many things: temptress, witch, traitor, queen. But history remembers only what was left behind: a drop of blood on white linen, a crown too heavy to lift, and a smile she never surrendered. They do not speak of the way her fingers trembled beneath her skirts, or how the tower's stone corridors swallowed her footsteps like a beast grown tired of meat. Anne Boleyn was not made of flesh. She was made of fire, of unread letters, of glances too long and laughter too loud. And yet, on the scaffold, she was made of nothing. The wind passed through her as if she had never existed, as if her name had already been peeled from the skin of time. Her downfall did not begin with accusation, nor with a kiss stolen in shadow. It began with a silence, a single, dreadful silence in which the king looked into her eyes and no longer saw a future. What curse lives in the body of a woman who dares to speak before men? What ruin follows the one who refuses to kneel? Anne stood not against the church nor the crown, but against the cold machinery of obedience, the black mathematics of power, the withering hunger of a king who devoured what he once adored. They built her grave before she fell. They stitched her shroud while she still walked. They sharpened the sword before the trial began. And when it was over, when the blade kissed the back of her neck like a lover come to claim his due, the silence did not lift. It thickened. It grew teeth. It began to feed. She was not the first queen to bleed for England, but she was the first to die with her eyes wide open. In the beginning, there was only her voice. Not loud, not shrill, never that, but sharp, unyielding, like a pin dropped in a cathedral. Anne Boleyn entered the English court not as thunder, but as tension, a single taut string in a room of indulgent laughter and drifting eyes. Her presence was not beauty in the traditional sense. It was sharper than that. Men did not admire her. They studied her, the way one studies a blade to see which edge might cut deepest. Her dark eyes held questions no one dared answer, and answers no one dared question. Her hands, delicate as they were, moved with certainty, folding letters that carried kingdoms, brushing fabric that would one day be soaked in betrayal. She did not smile to please but to warn, and when she laughed, it was the sound of a lock clicking into place. To those around her courtiers, rivals, even the king himself, she was a mirror held too close, revealing what they had hidden even from themselves. The court of Henry VIII was a theater of masks, each lord and lady rehearsing the dance of power with polished gestures and hollow compliments. And Anne walked through it all as though the music did not reach her ears. She danced when she wished, spoke when she must, and never bowed to anything but her own fire. That fire terrified them, not because it burned, but because it illuminated. It showed them how dull their lives had become. Henry, in his lust and loneliness, mistook that flame for warmth. He reached for it, thinking it could be held. But Anne was never meant to be held, only followed, feared, or destroyed. The halls of Whitehall echoed with her name before her footsteps had fully claimed them. There was something unnatural about her rise, not because it was fast, but because it was inevitable. The wives and mistresses before her had been like painted glass, beautiful from afar, fragile up close. Anne was iron wrapped in silk. Her ascent was not seduction, but invasion. She did not wait to be chosen. She stepped forward and made the choosing irrelevant. And in doing so, she rewrote the order of things. The courtiers whispered of sorcery, of French poisons and charms, of hidden marks and unholy power. But the true magic was this: she knew herself. In a world that demanded women be reflections, Anne was a flame, a voice, a mind that would not yield. She asked questions at supper. She read the forbidden. She spoke of the soul while others measured bloodlines. Her presence made even the Pope tremble. For here was a woman who had not only caught the king's eye, but led it away from Rome. When Henry tore the crown from his first wife and the church from its cradle, it was not for Anne's body, it was for her defiance. She did not merely tempt the king, she transformed him. And for that, they hated her. For that, they would build a pyre of silence around her, so high even memory could not climb. Anne's court was not a place of joy. It was a battlefield of silence, layered glances, and venomous prayer. Each curtain concealed a listener, each goblet a whisper. Even the tapestries seemed to hold their breath when she passed. She moved through her own chambers as one might walk through a dream turned sour, each step rehearsed. Each breath counted. The maids feared her but obeyed. The nobles envied her but smiled. Only Elizabeth, the child queen not yet born to tragedy, touched her without consequence. In the arms of her daughter, Anne's face softened, but never enough to forget that walls had ears and lullabies could be weaponized. Her enemies did not confront her. They surrounded her with gifts. They drowned her in velvet and lace, in jewels like cold eyes, in gowns woven not with gold, but with judgment. Every thread said you are only a queen because he wills it. But Anne knew better. She was a queen because she had made herself one. The title did not fit her like a borrowed gown. It bled from her skin. She wore it not with pride, but with understanding. Power is not granted. It is taken. It is held until it burns through the bone. It is loved only by those who do not possess it. Henry, once captivated by her defiance, began to fear its echo. What had stirred his blood now stained his sleep. He had crowned a woman who did not tremble, and worse, who still saw the cracks in him. Anne did not flatter his victories. She questioned them. She did not weep at his cruelty. She revealed it. She reminded him that the crown he had torn from Catherine still bled, that the church he had broken lay in shards, and worst of all, that his soul, if he still believed he had one, was growing smaller in her presence. For Anne's power was not only in her words, but in her stillness. She could reduce a room with a single glance, unravel a lie with silence, and in a court built on flattery, her truth was violence. It is not a coincidence that the walls of her apartments were colder than the rest, that the servants who served her would not meet her eyes, that her name, once carved into the breath of the court, began to vanish from lips as if spoken words might summon wrath. There were omens in her chambers, roses that died too soon, birds that refused to sing, mirrors that clouded without touch. Some said the devil walked beside her. Others whispered it was something worse, a woman who would not kneel. The queen's solitude was not physical, but spiritual. Even when surrounded by attendants, suitors, jesters, she stood alone, untouched in a crowd that watched her as one watches the final flame before darkness. Her books remained open long after the candles died. Her letters, unread, unsent, were buried beneath gowns she would never wear. She still received gifts, perfumed oils, foreign silks, music boxes that played no sound, but each was a reminder of the cage gilded around her, the very symbols of her triumph. Pearls, titles, golden scepters became shackles. Her throne no longer felt like a summit, but a pyre. And beneath it all, the king changed. His voice, once warm, turned mechanical. His hands, once trembling with lust, now trembled with suspicion. The laughter they once shared curdled into silence. His gaze wandered first to courtiers, then to couriers, then to corners she could not see. Anne felt it before it was spoken, not in a decree, but in absence. He no longer called her my queen. He called her madam. He no longer looked at her like a future. He looked at her like a mistake. The court that once danced to her rhythm began to shift its weight. Doors closed a little faster. Courtesies stiffened. Confidences faltered. Those who had once knelt eagerly now did so slowly, eyes averted. And through it all, Anne smiled. Not out of hope, but defiance. For even as the floor crumbled beneath her, she stood as if on marble. To lose the crown was nothing, but to lose herself that she would not allow. Her solitude deepened into prophecy. She knew she would not die old. She knew the throne was not built for women who burned, and so she prepared, not with fear, but with clarity. She watched the movements of those around her. She counted the silences between words. She noticed the way Henry now laughed too loudly at jokes that cut too close. She read in his eyes not rage, but relief. The cold gratitude of a man planning absence. And in that silence, she found her final resolve. They say the night before her arrest, she did not sleep, that she walked barefoot through her chambers, her feet silent on the stone like a ghost rehearsing its own death, that she paused before the mirror and did not look away, that she touched her own throat as if measuring where the blade would enter. But no one knows. No one can say what she truly saw that night, whether it was fire or forgiveness, dread or deliverance. Perhaps she saw nothing. Perhaps she saw everything. But when the guards came, when the door creaked open with the weight of doom, she did not scream. She did not weep. She simply turned. Her eyes, black as ink and twice as deep, met theirs without tremor. And in that gaze, something ancient passed between them, a truth older than kings, that those who live by silence die in thunder. And Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of a future yet unborn, walked into history not as a victim, but as a warning. It began with a whisper, the kind that snakes through corridors and settles into the folds of curtains, too soft to name, but too heavy to ignore. No proclamation, no thunder of royal decree, only a hush that spread like rot. The Queen was laughing too loudly. They said, speaking too freely, moving too boldly. She had looked too long at one man, and not long enough at the king. The rumors slithered between goblets and prayer books, woven into the hems of courtiers' gowns, passed from trembling lips to calculating eyes. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was that she was already guilty in the eyes of those who no longer needed her. Cromwell, the shadow who moved when the king refused to touch darkness himself, watched her from behind candlelight and columns, his ink-stained hands drafting not just her sentence, but her silence. He knew what the king needed, not a wife, but a scapegoat, not justice, but justification. And Anne, brilliant, proud, unbending, Anne had outlived her use. The woman who had once delivered England its greatest rupture was now a crack in the crown itself. And cracks are not mended, they are erased. The court changed its face. Former allies forgot her name. Gentlemen who had once bowed deeply now feigned urgency to avoid her path. Servants, once trembling with devotion, moved mechanically, eyes lowered, voices hushed. Anne noticed. She noticed everything. Her senses sharpened like a blade before the executioner's hand. Every glance was a dagger. Every silence a sentence. The faces around her blurred into masks, and behind each mask, a calculation. The king began to smile again, but not at her. He smiled at Jane Seymour, pale and pliant, a ghost with a womb. Anne's child had been born female. That was enough. Her womb had failed to house England's future, and now her body would become England's offering. But first, the spectacle had to be staged. The betrayal had to be theatrical, grotesque in its precision. They accused her not of rebellion, but of seduction, for that is the crime most easily whispered against women. They named her lovers, men of court, men of service, even her own brother, seeds of rot planted to birth disgust. None were safe. Their downfall was her stage, their deaths the chorus to her tragedy. Mark Smeaton, the musician, was taken first. His hands had once made joy. Now they were broken to make confession. They tortured his body until his words bled. Not truth, only what was needed. He spoke her name beneath the weight of iron and flame. The others followed Weston, Brereton, Norris, each man reduced to symbol, each name stitched into the Queen's noose. George Boleyn, her brother, was the final stitch. His laughter had once mirrored hers. Now it echoed through the tower like a curse. Their trials were not trials. They were theater draped in blood. Witnesses did not testify. They repeated what had been whispered to them in shadows. Evidence was air. Motives were irrelevant. The guilt had been chosen first. The facts assembled later. Anne sat through it all, not as a defendant, but as a ghost watching her own eulogy. Her gaze did not falter. Her back did not bend. She wore her crown of accusation with the same pride she had worn the real one high, unyielding, defiant. And yet, beneath that defiance, there was something else, a stillness, a quiet that spread across her like frost. Not fear, but something colder clarity. They came for her at dusk, when the sun made everything look more holy than it was. She walked between them, soldiers, priests, silence as if to a coronation. Her rooms had already been ransacked, her letters seized, her jewelry catalogued like spoils of war. The child, Elizabeth, was taken from her arms without ceremony, not with cruelty worse, with indifference. Anne did not scream. She merely looked. That gaze alone made men turn their heads, for in it was something that even kings could not kill: memory. They placed her in the tower, not as a guest, but as a sacrifice. The same tower where she had once awaited her crown now held her as it waited for her head. The symmetry was almost divine, or perhaps demonic. The air in her cell smelled of damp stone and rotting prayers. The light never touched the corners. Her meals arrived untouched by warmth. Her ladies-in-waiting wept when they thought she slept. But Anne did not weep. She counted days by the weight of silence. She watched spiders build their traps in the corners and wondered if they, too, had once been queens. The king did not visit. He sent letters, cold, distant, necessary. He spoke not of justice, but of peace, not of her innocence, but of his burden. He called her the lady now, not queen, never again queen. Jane Seymour's smile had already been fitted to the throne. The courtiers rehearsed new loyalties. The church prepared new blessings. History moved on while Anne still breathed. Her trial was held beneath stained glass and the scent of incense. She stood before her judges in a gown of black and a spine of iron. They read her crimes as if they were scripture. She answered not with denial, but with scorn. Her voice did not rise. It fell like a sword. When they sentenced her, the room did not cheer. It exhaled. A nation that had once burned for her now buried her in silence. She was guilty of being too much, too loud, too learned, too alive. And for that, she would be made less than nothing. A footnote, a warning, a name to be whispered only in regret. The men who died for her died badly, twisted on the rack, dragged to the block, their bodies broken before their blood dried. George, her brother, went to the scaffold laughing. They said he recited scripture, mocked the crowd, and died with his eyes wide open. The people watched and did not cheer. They turned their faces. They remembered, too late, that the dead had once smiled, that the dead had once danced. Anne heard the sounds from her cell, the murmurs, the muffled drums, the closing of gates. She knew the rhythm of death by then. knew how the tower sighed when it swallowed another name. Her ladies offered her prayers. Anne offered them silence. The executioner was summoned from France cleaner, faster, quieter, a sword, not an axe. The king's mercy was sharp and foreign. They said he delayed the execution, not for mercy, but for timing. He wanted it done, but not remembered. Wanted her gone, but not a martyr. So he waited. Let her rot in the stillness. Let her rot in the silence. And yet, Anne did not decay. She wrote letters, final and unsent. She rehearsed her death as one rehearses a wedding, with precision, with defiance, with knowledge that this was the only ceremony they could not steal. When the day came, the sky did not weep. It watched, unmoving. She was led to the scaffold in a gown of grey, her hair pinned beneath a veil that caught the wind like a ghost's breath. The crowd was thick with silence. The priest offered absolution. She offered a smile, not of peace, of victory, for even in death, she would remain unwritten. The queen who died for a daughter, not a son. The heretic crowned in blood. The wife erased to make way for a womb. She stepped onto the scaffold not as a woman condemned, but as a symbol ascended. The executioner bowed. She forgave him. They always do. The ones who have lost everything. Forgiveness becomes the only crown left. She knelt, placed her hands before her, whispered a prayer none could hear, and waited. The crowd did not breathe. The sword did not gleam. It moved. One clean stroke. No scream, no cry. Only the thud of flesh against wood. The sound of silk collapsing. The final breath of a kingdom's most dangerous woman. Her head rolled, eyes open, lips parted as if to speak one final curse, but the words were never given. They belonged to no one now. The body was carried away in haste. No tomb, no hymn, only the echo of steps that would never return. And in that silence, history shifted, not loudly, not with fire, but with a chill that moved through every stone of the tower, through every throne room, through every cradle and crypt. Anne Boleyn was gone, but the fear she birthed remained. They buried her beneath the floor, not in marble, not in sanctity, but in haste unnamed, unmarked, and unwept. The stone above her bore no royal title, no gilded inscription, only the dust of footsteps too eager to forget. She had died in silence. And so they sought to silence her legacy, to swallow her name like the blade had swallowed her breath. Yet in that quiet grave, beneath the cold bones of saints and the fading light of forgotten chapels, something refused to rot, not flesh, for that returns dutifully to the soil, but memory uncooperative, diseased with questions, sleepless in the minds of those who had watched her fall. For days afterward, the tower seemed different, not haunted, but hollow, as if something sacred had been destroyed, not with cruelty, but with calculation. The women whispered of strange drafts at night, of a perfume that lingered in her chamber long after her body was taken. The guards avoided the scaffold after dusk. The maids refused to touch her bedclothes. Even the crows, once gluttons for blood, grew restless in the trees. It was not a ghost they feared. It was the absence of justice, how it carved silence into every stone and left behind a palace full of mouths too frightened to speak her name. Yet speak they did, eventually softly, secretively. The daughter she left behind grew under shadow, a child of disgrace and disinheritance. Her mother's legacy stripped from court tapestries and courtly prayer. Elizabeth was not supposed to remember, but daughters remember what the world tries to hide. They remember the way eyes avert, the way voices lower, the way fingers tremble when brushing against forgotten things. Anne had been erased in the open, like chalk before rain. but the trace remained in her child's gaze, in the proud tilt of her chin, in the fire she swallowed without choking, and from that trace, a throne would one day rise again, not in forgiveness, but in reply. Until then, the court of Henry VIII pressed forward with its machinery of marriage, its endless appetite for innocence wrapped in silk. Jane Seymour took Anne's place not with triumph, but with terror, as though wearing a crown still wet with blood. The ladies-in-waiting crossed themselves more often. The tapestries grew darker. Henry's eyes, once filled with longing, now held only the cold weight of a man who had killed what he loved and felt nothing. But Anne's legacy was never meant to be soft. It lived in the sharp places in the minds of women who knew too much, in the records altered too late, in the mouths of poets who dared to rhyme her name with fire. Her fall became a pattern, a prophecy, a rehearsal of how power punishes those who carry it with pride. Even the priests who condemned her could not forget the way she stood, kneeling not in defeat but in control, offering her neck as if it were the final word in a long, defiant sentence. The men who lied to end her found their own stories unraveling, their own power questioned by ghosts that wore her face. Cromwell, her architect of ruin, would fall by similar hands, similar silence. The king would outlive them all, bloated with sin and incapable of peace. Yet even in his decline, he never spoke her name. He built her erasure with such precision that it stood taller than any monument a void no statue could replace. And in that void, Anne Boleyn lived. The tower itself became her cathedral, not in reverence, but in repetition, each stone a verse in her unfinished hymn. Tourists now pass through its halls with uneasy curiosity, touching the walls as if they might still hold the warmth of her final breath. Guides speak her story in flattened tones, stripped of agony, domesticated into legend, but the air does not forget. The ravens that perch on the battlements do not forget. Sometimes, they say, at the hour before dawn, when the mist rolls low and the cobblestones are slick with dew, a shadow moves across the scaffold as if rehearsing steps worn into time, not a ghost, but an echo walking not to her death, but through it, beyond it, as if daring history to follow. Her story is not one of martyrdom, it is one of revenge, so slow and patient that it blooms in the silence centuries cannot drown. For what greater vengeance than to become what they could not destroy? Anne did not die. She multiplied in daughters who ruled, in women who questioned, in every voice that refused to be sweet when it could be sharp. Her enemies had hoped that her name would fade, smothered beneath the piety of her replacements and the judgments of historians with trembling pens. But Anne was not the kind of woman history forgets. She was not built from the dust of obedience, but from the iron of will. Her downfall was not a fall, it was a release. Her final breath, stolen by the sword, became a wind that shifted the very direction of the crown. The church fractured in her name, nations realigned, and all for a woman they said was too proud, too clever, too dangerous. In the years to come, they would dress her story in caution, paint her as a lesson against ambition, as if her execution were a warning and not a confession of their fear. But the walls remember differently. The truth is not found in the records, but in the silence between them, in the page left blank after her sentence, in the eyes of her daughter as she ascended the throne wearing no man's name but her own. And so, the final days of Anne Boleyn stretch beyond her death. Beyond the fall of the blade, they live on in the uneasy silences of history, in the way her portraits were burned but her likeness survived, in how they buried her without ceremony, yet built cathedrals over the ruins she left behind. The women who followed her into history knew her name even if they never spoke it aloud. Queens who bent but did not break. Scholars who read what she read. Voices who carried her defiance like a relic. Anne Boleyn, The queen who defied a king, the mother of a virgin queen, the architect of her own destruction, did not vanish. She simply became what cannot be touched, a symbol too jagged to hold, too bright to blind, too real to kill. They said she died for adultery, for treason, for witchcraft. But she died for daring, for being seen, for making herself impossible to forget. And though they tried to erase her, to reduce her to a cautionary tale scrawled in the margins of men's ambitions, she remains, not in glory, not in pity, but in the terrible quiet between betrayal and consequence, in the air before a sword falls, in the stillness of a throne that remembers its weight. Anne Boleyn lives not in the past, but in every question the past refuses to answer. She is the moment before the scream, the silence that follows the strike, the shadow beneath the crown. And though her voice was stolen, her story still speaks, not loudly, not clearly, but persistently, like breath against glass, like footsteps in a chamber locked from the inside, like the last thought of a dying queen, not of regret, not of fear, but of what still waits to rise. Beneath the stone, she does not rest. She waits, not for justice, nor for remembrance. These are luxuries of the living, offerings for those who die quietly. Anne Boleyn was never quiet, not in life, not in death. Her silence was the kind that screams long after the sound has gone, the kind that seeps into wood, into glass, into the breath of those who kneel where she once stood. The blade that took her head did not end her, it unveiled her. In that final moment, as her body folded and the tower sighed in hunger, England learned that queens could bleed without breaking, that truth could be drowned and still surface. That legacy does not ask for permission. It arrives, uninvited, and it stays. The king who condemned her rotted alone, surrounded by wives who paled beside her shadow. The court that whispered her downfall died off. One by one, their names hollow without hers to echo against. The child they tried to erase grew thorns, and with them, a crown. Anne did not live to see it. She did not need to, for some flames, once lit, refuse to die. They flicker in the corners of history, daring the world to name them. Anne Boleyn was one such flame. They buried her beneath the chapel floor, but they could not bury the fear she inspired. They could not unwrite the silence she left behind, and so she remains beneath the footsteps, behind the glass, inside the breath of those who dare to look too long at power and ask, at what cost? The crown sits heavy, the sword falls swift, but the silence of the queen who defied both still lingers, and it listens.